that started.
Got it. Gonna skip ahead a little bit since that is a great launching point towards gardening. I was, doing a little bit of research, and you're growing mustard greens, celery, beets, Chinese broccoli, carrots, cilantro, lemons, avocados, sugar canes, beets, four different types of cucumbers. I think like three different types of strawberries. You're
Oh
interested
yeah.
in grafting, right? Like, I'm assuming onto a tree or another branch. So that is quite the large amount, and I'm sure there's probably even things on that list, right, that didn't even like
Mhm.
that aren't even I didn't even list. So you basically are running your own community farm at this point, from what it almost sounds like.
I mean, it's not a community farm unless it's enough to feed a community or share with more people in my community. That is something that I like have been learning more about, and like definitely luckily that I'm really good with like my neighbors and stuff like that, and I've given produce to like extra produce to them, and they've enjoyed that. But yeah, that is something that I'm working on and hoping to make even bigger, but definitely small steps. I've only been on this property for like a little bit more than a year, and I think right now it's mostly the vegetable garden that's producing, but when the fruit trees are producing, that's when it's going to be popping.
Got it. Like, take me back a little bit in terms of like, how did you really get into gardening? Is this something that like you learned from your family? Is this more you're learning
Mm.
from other friends, or maybe it's through YouTube, right? Like, what kind of help inspired and gave you the confidence really to, get into gardening? Because there's a lot of people that are like, oh, like they are lightly interested in gardening, or maybe they just want the end product, which
Mhm.
is like a nice flower that's already pre-built, or I shouldn't say
Mhm.
built, like basically already grown, and you're just taking the fruits of someone else's labor. But you are growing these from scratch, and these are very diverse plants that you are growing with all their different needs. So just kind of
Yeah.
talk to me about where that all sort of came from.
I think that I it could also stem from like again my family being immigrants and like wanting to have food and produce from home. I think there's actually a exhibit over in Houston, Texas about this, but a lot of Vietnamese Americans growing a lot of their own herbs because it's not something that you would normally find in mainstream big box grocery stores. Luckily, we do nowadays have more Asian groceries all over the coast, but I imagine that there was a time where it was difficult to find. It was much easier to grow some things on your own, like fish mint, perilla. Those things are in the mint family. Those grow like weeds if you just get them started. So we always grew up with those particular items, and if we could get their hands on it, it's always helpful to grow things that that what they were nostalgic for. I remember my mom was telling me that we were eating, I think it was jackfruit, I think last year, and she was telling, which is funny because like to me we have jackfruit all the time, but she was saying when we first came to the U.S., the cost of one jackfruit, like not even a whole one, just like half of one, was worth an entire month's paycheck, and like it would be so expensive to have, and if only they could grow something like that, they'd probably do it. Well, we luckily do have we haven't done it yet, but there are some people trying to grow jackfruit, and similarly like even as simple as bananas, to which like the Cavendish bananas that we have in the store are like not as good as like some of the OG bananas in other areas of the world. And my grandmother, she also like loved bananas, and that's something that for them considered too expensive when they first immigrated to the states. So being able to grow things, especially if they're hard to find, like dragon fruit, like to me, it's so easy to grow. All my family has it, but definitely when they first came to the U.S., it was so hard to find. It was so expensive. So I think that was important to them to, if they could, to grow as much as possible, because you can get that in the stores. And then, like my grandmother, I think is the only one that was really into growing florals. So I remember always watering roses, and it was my grandmother who was like really especially on top of nagging me to water the rose bushes. And so in my parents' new home, they didn't plant any rose bushes, but that's the first thing I planted in the front yard of my own home was like, I want some rose bushes. I feel nostalgic for my grandmother. So that's kind of like a call to her, a little dedication to her.
Dang.
Some
That's
nostalgia there.
Yeah, I was like, that's super symbolic, right? Like it's just something where it's like,
Mhm.
when you were growing up, uh, and to put that into your new house, right? It's almost paying homage,
Mhm.
right, to your grandparents
Mhm.
a bit. So that is
Yeah.
very brings tear to my heart, touches a string.
I know. I'm definitely planting banana trees because it can grow here. If I can find a good jackfruit, that is a maybe, but that's also very dangerous.
Do you think because you were talking about how it was harder to find specific like nostalgic plants and foods, right? That your parents couldn't get that
Mhm.
they in the US, at the time, and we're probably talking about like the 70s and 80s or something
80s,
like
yeah,
the
70s,
80s,
yeah. Mhm.
where that cross-cultural cross I don't know trade between Asia and the United States for specifically Asian oriented things uh probably wasn't as robust as it is, I assume now. Like I'm sure probably now you can
Mhm.
find those things, right,
So much stuff,
in a
yeah.
supermarket, but I'm assuming that they're also kind of expensive relative to obviously what they're used to growing up.
Mhm.
So do you think that like that anchoring effect is kind of like, hey, I know I could have gotten this way cheaper, obviously in, whatever, Vietnam. And it's just like there's a sense
Yeah,
of
yeah.
pride of saying like, well, I can grow it myself and I don't have to pay that money. And they'll probably say like, I don't know, it tastes better like when you grow it yourself, even though it
It's
takes like
100%,
way longer. There's like a sense of
100%.
pride.
I will agree to all of those things. It definitely there's a sense of pride because it's like taking ownership. You actually see the progression, and there's the anticipation of like, man, when these beets are done, I'm gonna rust them and be so hyped. There's definitely that. You're revitalizing the soil, helping the planet, and also it tastes so good. If you haven't had the chance to taste locally fresh grown stuff, I recommend going to the farmer's market. I remember because there are still some things that I'm not as experienced at. I only recently started growing celery, but I remember buying celery from the farmer's market for the first time and eating them like, this is the best celery of my life. Even carrots, I was like, this is the best carrot of my life. Why aren't all carrots like this? And when you learn the system of like how things are often shipped from out of state or from far distances, the quality, the second it's picked out of the ground, it starts to degrade. So the sooner
Makes
you can
sense.
have it from picked from the ground and onto your plate, the better in terms of taste, but also in terms of like nutritional value.
Talk to me about that piece a little bit when you're saying that there's a difference in taste.
Mhm.
Like I have this anecdotal sort of reasoning about the difference in when you eat a food, right? Let's say, for example, you're eating a carrot,
Mhm.
and when you eat a carrot,
Mhm.
like you eat a carrot that's, I don't know, I'm not gonna say generic, but just like your run of the mill carrot, right? It tastes like a
Yeah.
carrot. If you taste the
Yeah, it
best
tastes like
carrot
carrot.
ever, still tastes like a carrot, but it's like the 10 to 5, like whatever the 5 to 10 or whatever it is, like that extra 2%, right, of some part of that taste, right, is just much better.
Mhm.
And that, I don't know, extra 10 to 20% difference is what commands, like demand, right, for that specific you know
Mhm.
plant or whatever. And I just feel like it does take a certain level of appreciation for like, you have to actually enjoy eating a carrot, right? In order to actually want to pay more
Oh
for it,
yeah.
right? Like if you don't like carrots, it's like you're
Mhm.
not going to appreciate like this is an
It's true.
organic, carrot and, it's going to taste better. It's like, no, it still tastes like a carrot, but there's just that
Mhm.
subtle difference that like I feel like is a very refined palate.
I don't think you have to have a. I don't actually. It's funny enough. I don't think I have a very refined palate. I think my palate's garbage.
Okay.
And Charlie, my partner, he has much more delicate, refined palate. But like, I notice the difference between like the bottom of barrel carrot versus like the locally grown carrot. It's so good. It's the I would the what I would say is like the for carrots specifically, I wouldn't say it tastes better. I would say it tastes like one bite of carrot has the taste of 1,000 carrots in
Got
one
it.
bite of
Okay,
carrot.
so it's like enhanced. It's a stronger
Mhm,
flavor, like a stronger essence of that specific flavor, just
mhm,
in a one bite versus
correct,
like a
yeah.
weaker flavor of it. Okay, that makes sense. I
Yeah,
could see
in
that.
terms of flavor, yeah. And then for potatoes, to me, like, my homegrown potatoes are much more fluffy. For, like, tomatoes, the tomatoes are much more juicy, and so it's like it varies from plant to plant, um, but I think it's well worth it.
I mean, that makes sense. For a lot of the plants, right, that you're talking about, like roughly how long does it take to go from like seed to harvest, right? Are these like anywhere from, I don't know, a month, right, to an entire year,
Mhm,
right? Like talk to me about like all the things that you've kind of or I've listed out, right? From the
mhm,
mustard greens, whatever, to the like strawberries and potatoes,
mhm.
right? Like kind of is there a classification for how long kind of these things take? Like, just so that if someone was interested in growing these things, like, it's not like, "Hey, I'm waiting for 12 months and nothing's shown up." It's like, "No, you have to wait 12 months,"
Oh,
right? Like,
yeah,
what is that expectation like?
yeah, and you don't have to wait 12 months. There's, like, and there's some great movement too, like, you can't eat some of the seeds on their own, and so you can eat something as there are people that eat sprouts. You can eat, microgreens of a lot of, produce out there, so people eat microgreen, um broccoli or microgreen beets and stuff, and they'll put it on in their sandwiches. I've done that. Charlie and I have eaten a lot of microgreens in a lot of areas where there might not be a lot of sun. That's definitely a great food source to get your veggies is to grow microgreens, and you can get that in like 2 weeks to and in 2 weeks time. You can also do sprouts. You can put seeds, and in that case, you might not even oftentimes need that much sun. You can grow sprouts in like old milk carton container on your countertop and get bean sprouts that way. So you can get stuff in your belly pretty quickly, depending on what form you'd want it. So if you're talking about sprouts or microgreens, you can get that in like 2 weeks time. If you want herbs, you can get that herbs, leafy greens like lettuce, grow pretty quickly and can be harvested a little bit after there's some true leaves. Things like that do bear flowers and fruit will take longer and will have more requirements. So they'll require usually more sun and they'll have a longer growing period. And so that will take longer. But once you get this going, depending on the plant, they could last all season long, or they can even come back the following year. I live in an area where um, I can overwinter eggplants and I can overwinter peppers. So like once you get them established, they can come back year after year.
Makes sense. I mean, I can't imagine it ever really gets
Mhm.
cold in Orange County, so it's not like you really have a true winter per se.
It's a blessing and a curse though. So there are things that I find challenging to grow because it needs more of a cooling temperature. So for example, um, I haven't had a successful like big brassica family success. So I've grown Chinese broccoli, which is like small stalks, but I haven't grown a whole head of broccoli or a whole head of cabbage because simply it gets too warm too quickly here in my area. I should probably start as early maybe as September, October next year. But that makes it challenging. So even like lettuce can bolt and go into seed right away in my area. Cilantro is another one that wants to turn into a flower and seed right away because it gets so hot. So there are some challenges, but you can build microclimates and try to keep certain plants cool, provide shade. So that's just something I'm constantly learning about my land.
Cool, cool. We'll get into the land in a little bit because I know that there was a lot of work involved on that land. But I do want to ask, right? Like, if you could give any advice for, uh, planting stuff for people who maybe don't have as much of a green thumb. Like, what is the kind of
Mhm.
advice that you would give to one, make sure you don't kill your plants, right? And then two, what are some easy I'm not even going to say flowers, right? Like I'm going to say like what are some easy
Mhm.
uh what's the best way to say it, what are the easiest like, plants and veggies, right? Or like fruits and veggies that
Hmm.
you can grow, or even let's say root starches, right? That you could potentially grow
Hmm.
either uh, indoors, right? Because not everybody has a garden
Hmm.
like outside or
Yep.
outdoors. So something that's really flexible for either one.
What was the first part of the question? There was a
First part of the
question before this
question
one.
is
What
how
do
do
you?
you make sure that you don't kill plants, right? Like how do you keep them
Okay.
alive? Like what
Yeah.
are some basics around that?
Hmm.
And then what are some easy fruits or vegetables that you can grow indoors or outdoors that either or require like don't require a garden, like outdoor patio or whatever, like you can
Hmm.
have indoors, or can
Hmm.
also thrive outdoors as well.
Yeah. So, in terms of killing your plants, everybody kills plants, no matter how green your thumb is. Even professional farmers have crop failures. Even like folks with greenhouses that make your house plant, I believe it was like 30, something as high as like 30% of those plants die before they even get to like Home Depot. So everybody kills plants. It's fine. It's okay. don't don't feel bad about it. Don't think that you don't have what it takes. A seed already has everything that it needs to get going. Um, you just gotta just help it along, and if it doesn't make it, it's totally fine. Uh, so that would be my first advice. My second one would be, so the way I started is I started growing succulents first because those seem to be an easy gift that people get from like
Right.
weddings or things like that. And that started my life. And I've definitely killed a lot of succulents, surprisingly. But after a while, you can like level up to new things. So for myself, it was succulents, and then I started herbs, and then I started more flowering fruits and vegetables like tomatoes, and that's actually the same progression that I would recommend somebody would be to start with like herbs and leafy greens because they grow fairly quickly and they don't need as much sun, don't have as much of a requirement. And once you get comfortable with that, honestly, you might get super excited and like hyped, and you're like, I want to try this and that, and that's exactly what happened to me. If you have more limitations, like I mentioned earlier, you growing sprouts or growing microgreens could also be a route that you can go into. The only downside is that usually you require more seeds to do that, but you do get the benefits pretty rapidly. And that's sometimes all you need is to have enough success, like just one good success, just to keep the momentum going. That happens to a lot of people. That happens to me all the time. Like, oh, this works. I should grow a bazillion of these now. That's uh, how that can happen. But that's what I would recommend. And then another thing is, if you can get familiar with what grows natively in your area, because that's something that honestly can grow almost like a weed because it's where it's meant to grow. So for myself, I'm in Southern California. So there's a lot of native plants, like in terms of flowers, there's poppies, there's lupines. And then for edibles, we have wild roses that we can get rose hips from. We have sages, we have salvias, and plenty of things to start with if you just want to start with native plants.
Awesome. I think those are all like super good tips. I do like that you laid out like succulents are like one of the harder things to kill, but as a good starter plant, which I would also agree with, going all the way to like herbs and roots and stuff like that. So I can definitely see that progression there.
Mm.
Uh, Talk to me about how like proper water drainage and fertilizer is also like is that
Mm.
also impactful when we're thinking about like trying not to kill plants because some I know that there are times when we tend to overwater, right? Or we are watering
Yeah.
at a regular cadence, but maybe
Hmm.
we've watered it so much and we've grown a lot of other plants out there that on the same soil, right? That the
Hmm.
soil is just not as powerful anymore. So, I just want to get your take on water drainage and fertilizer
Hmm.
as it impacts just regular home gardening in general.
It's interesting. So, as I mentioned, when I was in Cambodia, they were growing things hydroponically or aquaponically, and there are, in often cases, no soil, no. The medium was gravel essentially, and they were almost always wet. So, some would argue you can never actually overwater your plants so long as it has good drainage. Oftentimes, the issue is so even water itself actually carries H2O. Roots need
Right.
oxygen. Sometimes, um, sometimes an issue could be that there's actually too much woody material or compost breaking down in your potted plants or in your soil, which sometimes people just use purely compost. And as things are breaking down, it actually depletes the amount of oxygen. That actually ends up being the cause of root rot, not necessarily the water itself.
Got it.
So it's yeah. So in those, which I actually only learned like recently, y'all. This is something that in looking at my own land, I'm very blessed to have sandy loam, which is pretty well draining. And then most plants can thrive over that. You just need to put some compost on top, and then you don't have to work the soil too much. There's no digging involved in a lot of what I do. So from that approach, just making sure that your roots are getting enough oxygen, either with good drainage, and that you don't want to just bury it in compost because that actually could have surprisingly negative effects. The compost is meant to be on top because, like, in nature itself, um, dead fruits and plants and veggies are usually on the surface, and I believe that's where compost and fertilizer should be for the most part. That's my philosophy there. Um, so I think that's something there's actually a YouTube series by Laguna Hills Nurseries by Gary Matoka, and he does actually a really good deep dive about soil structure and that concept as well. Um,
Awesome.
I'll drop you the link and you put in the show notes.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, we'll definitely feature
Yeah.
Laguna Hills nurturing for sure. Um, yeah, I would say so. I know you mentioned how that goes kind of outside because you're talking about like the sand. I forgot what you said. The sandy something, the sandy foam or
Sandy
whatever.
loam.
Sandy loam. Sorry.
Yeah.
As I'm assuming that's like there's the soil, right? And then there's, sand
Hmm.
underneath. So that's like the water drainage for like all the water that goes past the soil, stuff like that. But
Yeah.
let's say
E-
you don't
Every
have,
every
okay,
com-
go
every
for it.
like combination has like there's every I guess planting area or combination. It's usually a combination of it's usually a different level of sand, silt, and clay. And I just happen to have one where it's a little bit more of the sand than the clay side, but still has really good drainage. Um, but everybody everywhere has kind of the combination of the three
Got
in
it.
some form, just different percentages.
Makes sense. Where I wanted to go to was instead of outdoors, right? Let's say you are
Mm-hmm.
trying to plant something in a pot, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily have the sandy loam or the clay or anything like that. Like, how do you ensure that you can keep those, or one, I guess, try to recreate, or two, like, how do you ensure that those kinds of elements can still be successful in an indoor setting where, that obviously is
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily readily naturally available?
Yeah. It's funny because, like, for the me now would be if I'm doing a potted plant inside, I know what I have, so I would personally just, like, dig up my backyard and then just
Right.
plant in the plant
But
and
like
then
if
put
you're in
on
an
top.
apartment, let's say you're like, I don't
The
know, in New
Yeah.
York, right? Or somewhere it's like you can't just like
Mhm.
break the concrete and just like, all right, time to dig up the dirt. And I don't
Totally.
even know how good that dirt would be anyways, just because of all the stuff on top. But just want to get your take on
Mhm.
that.
So, I would there's so many different blends out there, but I would recommend just essentially so for, like, where the roots would live, you'd want a combination of either of something that kind of like can hold the soil structure. So either peat moss or coco coir. There's like pros and cons about either. Peat moss comes from like bogs, either. I think for North America, it's mostly from Canada, so it depletes the bogs there. So some people argue that it's not a sustainable, renewable source, but a lot of people are used to it, and it holds moisture and it does pretty good job. Most people are familiar with it. There's also coco coir, which is a little bit new. Primarily, it's leftover material from coconuts that's shipped over from um, Southeast Asia and South Asia, usually can have some salts in it, and so it has to be washed. So some would argue that's also an issue because more water has to be used to have it readily available for gardening. So again, pros and cons. I would recommend people do the research and make their own preferences. I have a little bit of each, and I'm still learning to see if there's any benefits there. But again, I'm very lucky to use the land I have. So you use something like that, and then you want something that'll help aerate the soil. So you can use perlite, or you can use some people also use pumice stones or combination of both for that, and that should get you going for like the soil structure and then fertilizer or compost on top.
Got it. So what you're saying is like, if I have, I don't know, a cup, right, or a mug, right, that I'm not going to use
Hmm.
obviously for drinking, right? Like, I would
Hmm.
imagine that it's okay. It sounds like it's okay if you don't necessarily have like a hole, because most pots have a hole for drainage, right? But what you're saying is like, you
Hmm.
just need to make sure that you have some harder substances that, provide a little bit more air so that the water has a place to kind of like uh not sit in the soil for the most part. Is
Yeah,
that is that
but
correct?
I think it would be good to have that drainage hole.
Okay.
I actually do not have drainage holes in all my stuff, but I've it's only the ones I feel confident in doing so. Um, but
Okay.
some plants, yeah, if they can sit in water. But it's nice to have that drainage hole as, I guess, a little bit of insurance. I've grown lettuce and some leafy greens in a cracky hydroponic style, which basically it's a bucket of hydroponic water,
Okay.
and you just put a plant in it, and it grows on its own, and it does really well. And there, in that scenario, there is no soil; it's just a bucket of water. So,
Got it. Yeah, I'm actually funny thing is I'm actually looking at one right now. It was for Chinese New Year, I believe, and like they sell kind of those like bamboo I guess like stalks where you just put it in water and it just like grows like the leaves and yeah, it just sits in water. I see the roots everywhere. So I know that
hmm.
definitely works out. A lot of the things that you're talking about actually uh kind of translate over actually to orchid growing a little bit, surprisingly, because
Hmm.
it actually doesn't really for orchids, right? I will say the common misconception is that it has to be potted in soil, right? Like it obviously needs air, infrequent watering,
Hmm.
fertilizer also very important because if you don't have soil, like you need to have the roots and stuff like absorb everything. Um, so much to the point where I guess my mom was actually killing her orchid, right? Because she didn't take it out of like the
Hmm.
plastic wrap and giving it enough air. And
Hmm.
so I'm in the middle of rehabbing one of her orchids. It's not flowering right now. It was kind of pretty
Yeah.
weak from last year, but the stems are definitely growing, and it's growing, a new set of green leaves. So uh, it just reminded me of a lot of the stuff that I'm already doing for the orchids already, just
Hmm.
with like drainage and aeration, the peat moss, like all that stuff. So it
Yeah.
was a helpful
I
reminder.
imagine that you're probably growing it primarily in like um with like bark or something. Like
Yeah,
arguably it doesn't have a lot of soil, it's just bark. Because I natively, I believe it just grows kind of like on the bark of a tree.
yeah,
The
exactly.
the
They're
roots
more
are
like
kind of aerial.
vines,
Yeah.
I would say. So yeah, no
Hmm.
soil. There's a mix of peat moss, which absorbs some of the moisture, keeps it a little bit
Hmm.
cool, and then definitely some wood chips and stuff like that to give it some
Yeah.
more aeration. Because a lot of times when you're buying the orchids, they already look good, like when you buy them from the store. But
Hmm.
oftentimes, like the roots are really constricted because it's meant to be
Hmm.
like that for packaging, as well as the peat moss is there to make sure that the roots just don't fly everywhere. But the if you have too much peat moss, it ends up like cutting out all the air, right? Because there's it's basically just used
Hmm.
as packaging material.
Yeah.
Cool.
And peat moss,
I
I think, is
Yeah,
also, I think, inherently, I think it also has an inherently lower pH, which some people like. So if you're trying to like grow blueberries in a pot, you might want to use um, peat moss over coco coir.
Describe to me what the pH level has to do with a growing environment.
Oh, yeah. So pH is like levels of acidity. So it can be more acidic or it can be more alkaline. Your soil can have a pH level depending on the plant. Some prefer a lower pH level, like blueberries and hydrangeas. They tend to prefer a more acidic soil. And then some plants might prefer something a little bit more alkaline. Um, but everything else could be usually pretty much in the neutral zone and flourish. But I think the level, I don't know the technicalities to it, but essentially like the level of pH makes it easier for certain nutrients to be readily available to the plant, and some plants need some different nutrients as opposed to others. So usually, that information can be easily found with a Google search. So
Sure.
if you're growing something that's new, you can do a Google search. That's what I often do, and how like I'll plant certain things together that might need certain um, nutrition. Blueberries being the biggest one, where being known for more desirably more acidic soil.
Got it. Speaking of like nutrients in the soil, do you have any, kind of tips on how you can use sort of everyday foods, right, to really, power up the nutrients, in terms of whether it's, I don't
Hmm.
know, maybe it's like rice water or like kind of things like that, things that you're already naturally going to soak, right? But like, let's say if you don't have fertilizer
Yeah.
or you need to like add more nutrients to the soil, right? Like,
Hmm.
what are some easy ways that someone could, basically have like this like super powered water that's really good for your plants?
Yeah, so that's something I'm actually still learning about. Some people will basically take certain greens and make their own natural fertilizers at home. A common one is like a weed fertilizer. So like it's like picking up all the weeds that you have in your house, soaking them in distilled or like neutral water and having it sit for a while and ferments, break down, and then using that water, diluting it with more water, and then using it on your plants. There are some folks, I'm still learning the recipes and stuff too, where for example they'll take carrot tops and they'll ferment that specifically for a specific um, nutrient value, or soaking bananas, using that for a specific nutrient value. So that's something that is available. Something Another easy, I think, more and broad entry level is making your own compost. There's so many different ways you could do it. There's worm composting, so getting a worm bin and then filling it with some browns being like carbon material, like cardboard boxes or like shredded paper or like dead leaves, and then mixing it with like your kitchen scraps, like your veggies and your produce. So like when you're prepping your vegetables, anything that you don't use, you can put into the compost and then have some worms break it down, um, and increase its population and continue to eat. I think it can eat its body weight in like 24 hours.
Oh
Another one is
crap. Okay.
bokashi composting, which is more of an anaerobic method of composting. So you'd want to get like an airtight container. In that form of composting is cool because you can also compost like meat and dairy. And so you just toss all that into an airtight container, put some bokashi grain, and that will kind of like ferment and pickle your compost. And then eventually you can put that in your garden. It does have a funky smell to it, so you want to put it somewhere where it would break down further, like back into a worm bin. Or you can do like an open air compost. So you just need like if you want to do it quickly, I would say like a 3 foot by 3 foot like space, and then you put your brown material and then your green waste, so like your table scraps, and then you just like will aerate it. So like flip it over every once in a while, and that will break down into something that you could use.